Our first speaker is Ian Zabarte, who's here, who is the principal man of the Western Band Shoshone Nation, Niue Segovia, Nevada. And I met Ian in Chicago last year. He's wonderful, and we are very, very lucky to have him. And I'm going to ask him to give you a little bit of background about himself, as I will with Judy and Steve. Thank you.
Good evening. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
So I want to thank you for taking your time to come out here on a Friday night and hear about the Shoshone people. We're the largest and oldest family in the Great Basin, 1,000 generation. And when I use words such as Nua, that's 10,000-year-old word that I'm using. And that reflects our identity and relationship with this land, because we developed language to describe our relationship with the land. I am the principal man of the Western Bands of Shoshone Nation of Indians. Our lands go from the Snake River to the Mojave Desert, bordering on the Sonora, approximately 40,000 square miles. The slide on the left, the yellow, is the Shoshone and Uto-Aztecan language stock. You can see the Comanche. Comanche are also Shoshone. We speak the exact language, and you can see in the center is our more accurate Western Shoshone Treaty territory defined by our own people. And then the one on the right is what the United States claims is our Aboriginal occupancy area, but one of the problems is we didn't have all those straight lines, so it's also not very accurate. So this is judicially determined by the United States. And in fact, as we go through this, I'll be able to show you where that claim fails. It is not, in fact, a transfer. Next slide, please. So this is the original map that was sent back by Dottie after negotiating the treaty. And below the red area that comes down the pork chop there, going from top to bottom, one way it says Digger or Paiutes, and going the other way it says unexplored. That's the portion of our treaty territory which was not defined well by this map, but it is mentioned in the treaty, and that's what we base our interests upon, which is our definition of the treaty, and the treaty boundaries are in Shoshone, which implies that Shoshone have jurisdiction. Next slide, please. So treaties are not a grant from the United States. They are negotiated among sovereign nations, and the European powers, including the United States, knew that they were entering into these relations with other sovereigns. So treaties emanate from international law. We possessed everything. The United States sought to purchase from us rights, titles, and interests specific to U.S. needs, and we held those in trust for the United States. The United States agreed to pay $5,000 a year for 20 years, and we're not exactly sure that all those payments were made. But some of the records reflect that some were made, and the federal statute which created the territory of Nevada, which is the organic law for Nevada, specifically states that no portion of Indian country will be included in the boundaries or jurisdiction of any state or territory so long as such remains the same by treaty and without the consent of the Indians. So we do not consent to the inclusion of our property, our country, our boundaries into the any state or territory, into the jurisdiction of any state or territory. We want to make that very clear, which includes about the 4 million acres here in Southern California. California apparently claims that they own Shoshone property under the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. That just doesn't do it. Article 11 specifically states that the United States will solemnly prevent those incursions which might make us homeless. And in this case, that's where we talk about nuclear weapons testing and nuclear waste, because the United States is violating the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo as well. This is Yucca Mountain from earlier this year. You can see from this location, it is about maybe 8 miles over to the mountain. So halfway between, you have at least these 3 cinder cone volcanoes. The mountain is saturated 90% with 10% water in the pores of the rock. So when they did heater core testing at the repository Horizon, it was literally raining in that area because the heater was cracking the rocks open and the water was being released. And this is one of the pathways for release of radiation at Yucca Mountain into the accessible environment, because Yucca Mountain's above the water table. And the original purpose of deep geologic disposal was subsea bed or under the water table. And unfortunately, we have a problem with gravity. We have a problem with fracturing of the rock. It's called welded tuff, but it fractures, and we are in a seismic hot zone. The third most seismically active region on the continent. I think now they've said we're number 4. Same problem though. Earthquakes are not good. So this is our first contention, that essentially the Department of Energy cannot prove, on the last bullet, the DOE is required to demonstrate that the geological repository operations area must be located in and on lands that are either acquired lands under the jurisdiction and control of the DOE, or lands permanently withdrawn and reserved for its permanent use under 10 CFR 63.121, A12, and 10 CFR 63.121. That's essentially what our contention is, that the treaty's in full force and effect and a significant encumbrance upon the United States. Congress feels that it's just a matter of enactments. We see this as something different. We see this as a matter of environmental racism, institutional racism, if you will, by the various occupants, because we're just not talking about high-level nuclear waste. We're talking about weapons of mass destruction. We're talking about human radiation experimentation when we consider the secrecy behind the agencies developing this repository, coming from a culture of secrecy in the developing of weapons of mass destruction, and we think that that's very important on this issue. That's how we feel. We feel that we've been targeted and we're vulnerable to violence. The greatest thing we achieved when we signed that treaty was peace, and that peace is being violated, by machinations of the United States government, and we're getting to the bottom of this. So I appreciate your having me here that we can have this discussion. Next slide, please. This is the standard. Prior to this case in 1941, anthropologists were arguing both for and against Native Americans. And in the Shoshone case, we had an anthropologist named Julian M. Stewart who argued against the Shoshone, the Ute, and the Paiute. This individual lost in those arguments, but then went on to work for the Justice Department, and we believe maintained this policy of disenfranchising the Shoshone in light of the new need of the United States to develop weapons of mass destruction, to maintain the Cold War posture against Russia. And we bore the burden of that, of the risk for all of those weapons testing. Well, I guess the government shared with everybody across this continent, and we're witnessing a lot of cancer these days from many different sources. But this is the case which set the standard that until Indian occupancy is extinguished. This is from the Ninth Circuit Court, and it went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that unless there's a clear and explicit extinguishment of Indian title, Indian occupancy, then the land hasn't been transferred. So this is all in the slides, which I'm sure you'll be having access to. So next slide, please. Based on where things are now in the proceedings, so our contention in the proceedings is the Department of Energy cannot prove site ownership. And this is from the Department of Energy's website. You can go there yourself and find this information. It hasn't changed. It was last updated, I think, more recently, but it's still the same. NRC has found that DOE has met all the applicable regulatory requirements, but at the bottom, NRC staff determined that DOE has not met the regulatory requirement regarding ownership and control of land where the geological repository operation area would be located. So those are our contentions. Next slide, please. We also have a contention on water. Water as a property right, water as a intimate part of our identity. There's a spiritual, a religious context here that we view water in a very sacred way. I brought Steve Osotama. He's on our board at Puebla. Puebla is the Shoshone Healing Center in Tacoma, California, that was founded by Shoshone spiritual leader Corbin Harney. And it is a spiritual relationship because we have what we believe is a way to cure many diseases, and you have to understand or believe in the purity of that water. And these days there's not as much pure water, and we only have one water. So it's important that we understand the high level of interest and reverence that we have for pristine, pure water. We're not having it anymore. We got to get rid of using these plastic bottles too. I saw earlier that there's a carbon stick you can drop into a jug of water, and it takes the impurities out of it, but we don't need to be using this plastic. It's breaking down in the ocean and breaking up at a molecular level and being resuspended back up into the rainwater. So that's why I'm talking about water and the importance of pristine water. How is this water going to cure us if it's polluted? You have an unhealthy mother will produce unhealthy babies is what we tell people or try to teach people. But water is very important, and the Department of Energy hasn't responded to our concerns. The Environmental Protection Agency hasn't responded to our concerns. And when the Nuclear Regulatory Commission staff were to review environmental justice guidelines, which is looking at low-income, minority, vulnerable populations with subsistence lifestyles, the NRC staff couldn't find anybody within their region of influence and found that there is no risk. The risk to Native Americans would be minimal without doing any further field research. Next slide, please. And then this is our NEPA requirement. Essentially, what we did in the 90s, we were asking, early 90s, what's happening to our plants, to our animals, what's happening to our land. We were seeing huge vulnerabilities in the land. The same problems we were seeing in our people. And what we did was collaborated with the Childhood Cancer Research Institute to look at our animals, our people, and see what kind of vulnerabilities or what was happening to our people, and we found that there were vulnerabilities. So we took researchers hunting and showed them what we hunted, talked about how often we hunt, how we prepared our food, and what we came out of that study was lifestyle differences are important. So diet, mobility, and shelter. Diet, what we ate, how we prepared our food, and that we ate all of the animal. So this includes the thyroid that may have absorbed radioactive iodine, if it's rabbits and deer and antelope, some of our staple foods. We were looking at our pine nuts and other trees, our pine trees. So mobility, what we did, where we went and what we did there, whether it be hunting or sweats, and we would use dead wood traditionally because the green trees are our staple pine nut food. So we'd use dead wood, which could have been exposed to radiation, and we may have been giving ourselves another dose by heating our houses with wood and shelter. Where our houses were, what they were made of, and the fact that we spent a lot more time outside than other people. So we looked at these factors and we found that based on lifestyle differences alone, our exposure using what we call the rabbit model, since we ate a lot of rabbit, was significantly higher than the non-native population that the Department of Energy studied. So that's our contention. It's the basis for our our comments to the Environmental Protection Agency on the radiation exposure levels. And we've communicated this to the EPA. We've communicated this to the Department of Energy and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and they have failed to consider this. Next slide, please. We're going to continue to prosecute these issues at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So this is what we have to add to our thinking as Shoshone, but I think everybody needs to do this because in 2007, I believe it was, or 2005, the National Academy of Sciences Biological Effects of Ionizing Radiation, Beer 7, first time any U.S. agency has made such a statement that there's no minimum threshold for radiation carcinogenesis, and that they specifically reject hormesis. And basically what that means is that there's no minimum threshold for cancer, and that the effect of radiation exposure is cumulative. So we have to consider our exposure to this. In the past, I was lucky enough, just a little bit of my background, I was born in San Francisco while my mother was off the reservation, but every summer we were back on the reservation. So I grew up with dirt floors. I grew up bathing in the creek. We didn't get electricity on my reservation, which is 300 miles north of Las Vegas and 300 miles east of Reno, until 1976, when they brought the electric power line in. And then we couldn't afford anything. We didn't have any of those appliances that you may have had until sometime in the 80s or 90s. And they were very expensive to have, so not everybody had those things, and we just didn't benefit from nuclear energy or electricity or all of the hustle and bustle and the commerce that was going on. We were and have been left isolated, and to this day we're alive, we're living, and we're not going anywhere, but you know, the abuses and the marginalization continues of our people. And so we have to get out, and we're out here talking to you and trying to explain to you why this is an abuse, why it's a violation of our basic human rights, and why it's environmental racism. Next slide, please. So my community would be top of the middle, where that gray patch is, just north of there. But this is cumulative exposure just in the area of the Nevada test site. Out to the right by Utah is the Moapa River Indian Reservation, the Southern Paiutes. I was the human resource there and the environmental director there. I was able to shut down a coal-fired power plant, the #1 contributor to regional haze in the Grand Canyon. We used the argument that because of our past exposure to radiation in fallout from US and United Kingdom testing of weapons of mass destruction, we can't endure any increased burden of risk from any source, including technologically enhanced naturally occurring radioactive material, which is the coal ash from the coal-fired power plant, because all coal contains uranium. And when you burn coal in a power plant, it increases the concentration in the coal ash, and then that is placed just 400 miles from the tribal community and blowing into the reservation. I was living there for 5 years, so I had the experience of the coal ash, which is like glass, and it gets into your lungs, and you're breathing this and you're coughing it, and it's just chewing up your lungs. So I was able to shut that place down using that argument, and the fact that we were developing a utility scale photovoltaic solar power plant to feed Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. One thing to note is that the power plant was owned in part by California Water Resources to do pumping for California. So California was going green in 2012, 2008, 2010, 2012, and it's coal-fired power plants killing Indians in Nevada. So those are part of the experiences that we have. So I went on to develop, did project development on this 2.5 million acre photovoltaic solar field for the Moapa Bandit Paiutes. And it was the combination of showing real indigenous leadership and demonstrating how bad this coal industry is, and that it's violating people's health. So I think we have to incorporate all of these different exposures, different exposure pathways and risks into our thinking. Next slide, please. Again, this just goes to the safety evaluation report and talks about the restart of the project. I think it was entirely appropriate for the president to ask for the withdrawal of the license application by the Department of Energy, since there are issues of international treaties involved. However, in the case that went before the Circuit Court of Appeals, that was not argued. The United States doesn't want this matter of Shoshone ongoing and existing treaty-defined rights to be addressed. So they didn't argue with that. The proceedings are back on, and we are prepared and feel confident that we're going to defend our interests in these proceedings. We're the only unfunded party. You know, if we consider that a range of about $1 million per contention, I brought 3 parties, 9 contentions. For me, it cost a couple of $1,000s. For the other parties, you know, if you look at Clark County that has 15 contentions, about $15 million. Nevada has 290 plus contentions. It probably cost well more than that. But we're, like I said, we're very streamlined and narrow. This is Shoshone property. The issues are ownership and institutional racism. Next slide, please. And there we have it. So the supplements, I think it was in 2015, requested the Nuclear Regulatory Commission wanted the Department of Energy to do the supplement. The Department of Energy refused, so the NRC staff did it. And again, as I mentioned earlier, without doing any additional field work, the NRC said there'll be no impacts to indigenous people or Native Americans. They'll be minimal. And we don't agree with that. The impacts would be small. Next slide, please. Here's transportation routes, the majority of which are through Shoshone territory. We're going to prepare ourselves for the Department of Transportation, Surface Transportation Board on these issues. We believe that what the Department of Energy has created in their Yucca Mountain Cultural Resource Studies amounts to a deliberate and systematic process for dismantling Shoshone living lifeways in relation to our country. Okay, they've developed a process called cultural triage, and if we keep going through the slides, and if they hold out, I think we'll get to that so you can see. So we essentially believe that this is legislative malpractice for the United States Congress to develop land that isn't even part of the United States as a nuclear waste repository for commercial profit. So destroying vulnerable people's land, violating our basic human rights, and doing it for profit. That's why we call it environmental racism. But it goes further. They developed this proceeding. Next slide, please. This is the Defense Waste Repository. It can put any place that the United States wants it to for national security, and it's got about 15 years worth of nuclear waste transportation. But if you already did everything to put a defense waste repository somewhere, you might as well put 120,000 metric tons of heavy metal from all of other reactors there. Why not? Next slide, please. That's something to be concerned about. So again, this is what I said. We informed the United States that our lands aren't for sale, and that we can't endure any increased burden of risk, and the United States is destroying our lands and our people. Next slide, please. So it's a little bit hard over this. So right down here where I say cultural triage. So genocide became a crime in the United States in 1987 under the Proxmire Act, which is the U.S. enactments of the UN Convention on Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. So genocide is the systematic destruction of a people in whole or in part, and we contend that the United States has engaged in genocide with the cultural resource studies at Yucca Mountain, which define the term cultural triage as the forced decision-making by an ethnic group to a development project. Triage is a word of French origin. It means to sort of cull according to quality. Its normal usage is flood, famine, natural disaster, and just declared wars, where the just party is the Christian party. That isn't the Shoshone. We're not the just party. This is being done to us. There's no flood, famine, or natural disaster in Shoshone country. What we have is a deliberate act by the United States to dismantle our living culture for the benefit of the United States and the profit of the nuclear industry. And this process of taking waste from all these reactors, your communities bore the burden of risk. You had jobs. Maybe some of you had some of the revenues, electricity, pensions. I heard somebody talking earlier about these things. We don't have any of those things. But we're being told we're going to bear the burden of risk, not just from one reactor, but from 115 reactors from 75 sites in 30 states. Those individual waste streams will become a river in our country, and we're supposed to add that to the burden of risk we've already suffered on behalf of this country. That is not fair. That's not justice, that's racism. Violates our dignity, violates your dignity as human beings. Next slide, please. So as I said, we're trying to exhaust our domestic remedies. We always try to do these things. We're in touch with other governments. We're looking at this government. We saw, I think it's Shimkins in an article saying that, well, I find it hard to see how the Shoshone claim's gonna mean anything when we got a fence around that place over there. Well, let's just use a little bit of reasoning here. The Department of Energy said that radiation exposure will stop at the protected environment, which is that boundary, that fence around the Nevada test site. Things are fluid. And so is this issue. We're trying to get our homeland established under the treaty. It's already part of the treaty. We're looking for our treaty reservation. That's where we can start. Because we have no place right now. We have spotted little tiny reservations. As I mentioned, that these, somebody asked me, who are your enemies? And I said, we don't have enemies. We have criminals and criminal behavior in the United States government. And these people are trying to do this. These people who are violating our basic human rights, these are issues of humanity. And we're going to pursue them. I think that these people in Congress, give me a chance to serve, give them service, and I'll pursue them for the rest of my life for crimes against humanity. Next slide, please, if there is one. These are some of our published research. We'd like to do more research. I'd like to do research on the vulnerability of the land because we have a problem with weeds. And I believe that the fallout from the weapons testing created huge vulnerabilities in the land where the noxious and invasive plant species that people brought from around the world have now taken hold in those vulnerable areas and dispersed. And I believe it's the weapons testing. I finally found a photograph where the fallout cloud was going up the valley and touching both sides of the mountain. So we have these problems across the continent. And you can also look at the 1997 National Cancer Institute report on radioactive iodine-131 and fallout from U.S. weapons testing and assess your own exposure based on your county. California is pretty clear, but you never know because we're all downwinders. Thanks.
Steve Frishman is coming first. He is the Technical Policy Coordinator for the Nevada Agency for Nuclear Projects in Las Vegas. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, and thank you, Ian. Ian and I have been friends and discussing things since about when he was a teenager.
Can you use it?
Use the mic.
It's on.
You asked her just a very quick little bio. I've been technical policy coordinator for the Nevada Agency for Nuclear Projects since 1987. Before that, I was the director of the Nuclear Waste Programs Office for the state of Texas, when Texas still had sites under consideration for repository. And part of the reason I got there is because between 1980 and 82, I was vice president of the Texas Environmental Coalition, so I automatically got a seat on the advisory committee that was advising the Texas congressional delegation on the writing of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982. So, I've been trapped for quite a few years. Interest is reviving in the suspended Yucca Mountain potential waste repository, and you've seen it growing in the news over the last year or two. There are really several reasons for this happening, and just one of them is the planned closing of Diablo Canyon that many of you have been involved in, and the plan is working. And there's going to be glitches, as we have heard, but overall, I think nobody could expect a couple of years ago that this was going to happen. So, good for you. We appreciate your invitation to discuss the Yucca Mountain situation, and I think it's been going on so long that people seem to think of Yucca Mountain, they see a picture of an open adit to a mine, and they think it's ready to go. Well, we're going to be talking about how it's not ready to go. And I'll start off with just sort of giving a situational picture of sort of how we got here and what the real problems are, and then Judy will pick up with everything that I didn't say. The cartoon that you see up here is by Jim Day, an editorial cartoonist for the Las Vegas Review Journal, who's been mocking the Yucca Mountains project for many years. He's finally retired, I think, but he's published a couple of books of just his Yucca Mountain cartoons. And what this sort of depicts is in 2010, when the Department of Energy tried to close out its Yucca Mountain license application because they decided that it was unworkable, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. The word sort of got around that we expect that this thing is dead. So this was Jim's take on the dead Yucca Mountain. And the title of this program is Yucca Mountain, is it viable? And my answer is a fairly simple one. It's a complex 30-year-long story, and here's why the answer is no. And some of the contributing elements to why we believe that it is unviable, and we'll go through these, not necessarily in this order, and not necessarily this simply, but we'll get a look at it. There have been consistent policy shifts since 1982 in the U.S. policy towards management and disposal of high-level waste. There's been what we refer to as regulatory bias, and we refer to it as that because the regulations change when the site doesn't meet the regulations. There are numerous technical safety issues, and I'll sort of give you a feel for it, and Ian has talked to you about some of them. There's been an array of legal entanglements, and there are still existing legal entanglements that are just in suspension right now. They will be revived if the case is reopened. There are significant cost issues that have plagued the program since 1983. There are legislative options that are sort of bringing things to the fore right now. And I'll talk about those and give you sort of the status on those, because things are changing all the time, as late as Wednesday this week. And there are also societal issues that need to be discussed, and Ian has given you a sample of one of the major societal issues. There are others that affect the state of Nevada and the people and its economy, and also just looking at how these things don't necessarily get looked at because the Department of Energy doesn't want to look at them. So just a quick timeline. Next slide, please. And we'll sort of run through this. These are just sort of how we got where we are. Nuclear Waste Policy Act in 1982 sort of set the stage for everything and said deep geologic disposal is the policy of the United States. In 1987, because there was a lot of political upheaval and because things were not going very fast and because the cost of just getting to a site to characterize and getting a site characterized had gone from, in 1982, an estimated $80 million to, in 1987, an estimated $2 billion. And there were differing bills in the House and the Senate and the conference committee. The bills were very different. Nevada was not represented. States that had potential sites, such as Texas and the state of Washington, were in leadership positions in Congress. And when the members walked into the conference to try to reconcile the two bills of what to do, because things weren't working very well and it was getting very costly, the first line out of anybody's mouth was, "We're talking about Nevada, aren't we?" And everybody said yes. So Yucca Mountain was born in politics. In 1992, it was understood by literally everybody in a position to review it from all parties, that Yucca Mountain would exceed the generally applicable radiation protection standard from the Environmental Protection Agency. Everybody agreed that it would. So the Department of Energy went to the Environmental Protection Agency Science Advisory Board and asked them to consider changing the radiation standard for Yucca Mountain, and just for Yucca Mountain. That's all they were concerned with, because that's all they had. The Science Advisory Board refused to do it. After a long review and a really very deep analysis, because if they could have justified doing it, they probably would have. The United States Technical Review Board was the next stop by DOE. They're a federal advisory committee that oversees essentially the technical validity of the Department of Energy's work. DOE made the case there after considerable work and a lot of debate. They refused to recommend to Congress that the regulations be changed. So the Department of Energy went to Congress, and ultimately in the 1992 Energy Policy Act, the requirement was made for EPA to write a site-specific standard for Yucca Mountain. Never mind the general standard. The general radiation protection standard applies to the waste isolation pilot plant in New Mexico, just doesn't apply to Yucca Mountain. And they also required that the EPA contract with a panel of the National Academy of Sciences to report on what represents the technical basis for a radiation protection standard that would apply to Yucca Mountain. The NAS, after a couple of years, produced a standard, or produced a report that the EPA eventually ignored the major part of, and eventually got sued, and eventually lost. In 2001, when the Department of Energy was finally getting ready to recommend the site to the president to go forward, the Department of Energy drastically changed its own siting guidelines and removed all disqualifying conditions for the site. The EPA had a new rule that was vastly different and relaxed, and changed from quantitative standards that must be met for radiation protection to a performance assessment approach, which is essentially just a risk assessment model. And it deals, it's a probabilistic model, and because of all the uncertainties and the parameters at Yucca Mountain, small twists in some of the dials make very big differences in compliance determination. The NRC, because it's supposed to conform its licensing rule to the EPA standard, also relaxed its standards. In 2002, this Energy Secretary, under the Waste Policy Act, recommended to the site, to the President, for development as a repository. The act allowed Nevada to file a notice of disapproval that would have stood as a veto, except if it is passed, except if it is overridden by both houses of Congress. And of course, we were the only site, and of course, we were overridden. In 2008, DOE finally submitted its license application after having problems with, among other things, actually making available a complete database for the license application. And in 2010, the Department of Energy came to the conclusion that the site was just not workable. And their determination was primarily based on the really intense objection from Nevada for about 23 years. And they just, they saw that they just weren't going to get there. But, and some of that involved the lawsuit against the EPA rule that I mentioned earlier that we won. The problem with DOE's document basis for licensing, which eventually caused them to have to go back and spend a few years trying to get it right. So in 2012, the department, at the direction of the president, put together the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future to try to figure out what to do. What should a new policy be for the United States for waste management and permanent disposal. Their report made a couple very strong recommendations. One of them is that we've tried forcing a site on Nevada for decades. It didn't work. And they didn't really analyze the Nevada situation at all. They just said, forced siting doesn't work, so consent-based siting is what we have to try to do, because otherwise we'll probably never get anything. So they strongly recommended a consent-based siting approach. Their analysis of what represents consent-based siting was sort of left people to figure out later. So the idea is good, and the more we discuss and other people discuss, the less we really understand what consent-based siting means, but we also know that there are some examples where it has worked, such as in Sweden and Finland, and it seems to be working in France. Now, in 2013, after the NRC had suspended the licensing proceeding, partly because DOE didn't want to play, but they were forced to, and partly because NRC wasn't getting any funding. in 2010, funding for the whole project had been cut off. And that was largely because Senator Reid from Nevada was in a condition or a situation as majority leader where he was able to do that. So in 2013, because of a lawsuit in the Circuit Court of Appeals in the District of Columbia order, the NRC had to resume the license application review, but the court can't order Congress to give them any money. So they had some carryover money, and the court said, you must continue the license application for as long as you have money, whether it's using the carryover money or whether Congress gives you new money. So right now they're in a situation where the funding is almost entirely exhausted. The NRC staff has completed its review of the license application, and the licensing hearing remains suspended, and it will remain suspended until Congress appropriates any more money. The licensing proceeding is an adjudicatory hearing, and it's probably, well, it is the most complex one that NRC will have ever faced. There is a total of 299 contentions, and Ian told you about their contentions. Contentions are single issue objections to a factor in the license application or in the environmental impact statement. The contentions, it was decided, have to be single issue contentions, and that's part of why there are so many, because many are interrelated with each other. Nevada, out of that list, has 218, and we have we've been working to where we'll probably have, if it resumes, we'll probably at least petition to have 30 to 50 new contentions added because of new things since 2010, or 11, when the proceeding was suspended. The cost is not been considered by many people, but to do like a 4 to 5 year licensing proceeding, DOE has estimated that'll cost about $1.66 billion. NRC estimated their cost for the licensing proceeding, $330 million. And Nevada estimates in that time to prosecute our 218 plus contentions, it's probably going to cost us $40 to $50 million. The key contention areas, which are, I think, sort of a key to it, are in two major categories. One are safety contentions, which are contentions about the license application itself. And the other is NEPA contentions, National Environmental Policy Act, having to do with the EIS, the final EIS, and supplements, and there's 3 or 4 different documents that sort of make up the NEPA part of it. Included in the question about ineffective geologic barriers is, among other things, the groundwater contamination problem that Ian was talking about, and it's a National Environmental Policy Act contention because the safety contentions only involve the site itself. Outside of the site is where we have to be concerned, or we are concerned about contamination of groundwater that isn't within the boundaries of the site. So it's treated as part of the environmental impact statement process rather than a safety contention. And if we go just a little deeper about our contentions, post-closure safety, the rule is for 1 million years, and the site is unsuitable. The site can't contain the waste. And the reason it can't is pretty simple, and that's that it's very fractured up, and groundwater or infiltration water from rain and snowmelt travels very rapidly down through the rock in the site. It will contact the waste packages. It will eventually corrode the waste packages, pick up waste in solution, carry it down to the water table. Groundwater is moving to the south. The first contact would be with irrigation and domestic wells in Amargosa Valley, and water to supply the biggest dairy in the state. And so they'd be the contamination that has been brought into the groundwater supply in that area will first be for the people and the agriculture in Amargosa Valley. Eventually, the water flows under the Spring Mountains and comes up into the springs in Death Valley that is part of what Ian was talking about, because that's the Temperature Shoshone one of the Temperature Shoshone reservations. And they rely on that water both for use and for spiritual value. So the fact that Yucca Mountain can't contain the waste is a real key to it. And the Department of Energy, once they realized that, applied engineered barriers to try to overcome or compensate for this. So what they did was design corrosion-resistant waste containers with a metal that has very little history and certainly requires extrapolation to 1 million years. And depending on who's doing the research, its level of corrosion resistance is either very little or a lot. There's almost no in between. It's just a probabilistic thing, and there are two ends to that probability. That at one end of it is during the million-year performance assessment, which is the probabilistic risk analysis, out to about 800 million years for these engineered barriers, including a drip shield that's sort of a redundancy in case water drips on the or would drip on the metal waste container and corrode it pretty quickly. A titanium drip shield that looks almost like a rural mailbox will be put over the waste container. And titanium has different corrosion characteristics from the alloy that they want for the waste package. So they claim that they have sort of redundancy, but both of those would be all gone. Some of them fairly early in that period, but all of them, according to the performance assessment, all of them would be gone by about 800,000 years. And then you see what the natural barrier is. And the natural barrier has an uncertainty bar of about 2 orders of magnitude. So it means that any value that you find in there has a chance of being about 1% right. But somewhere within that range is what they think is the correct value. So the uncertainty in just the knowledge of, first of all, what happens to the engineered barriers, and then what happens to or how the geology and hydrology actually perform is very large for the type of analysis that we really need, because you only get one chance at this. The pre-closure safety is an issue. Surface facilities are vulnerable to earthquakes, and we had one in 1992 that was a 5.8 right in the vicinity. Also from human error, which has been looked at by DOE but not looked at very well, and other types of natural disasters. We have flooding. When it rains in the desert, it usually rains really hard. We have very few drizzle days. Now, transportation impacts are another of the major concerns that we have over on the NEPA side. And the final supplement to the EIS that has to do with groundwater contamination that Ian was mentioning has some big flaws in it, and we've written some contentions about those. If the Congress is really worried about costs, cost is not being considered right now in any real way by the members of Congress who are the zealots to get Yucca Mountain going again. Just to obtain or to go through the licensing process is going to cost about $2 billion. And that's over 4 to 5 years. So you're talking about $400 million a year that they're going to need for that. Constructing and operating the repository in the last estimate is about $80 billion on top of the $15 billion that's already been spent. So we're looking at, and that's in a 2013 estimate. And so that's going up all the time. And the Government Accountability Office, not too long ago, was asked to analyze what it would take to restart Yucca Mountain, because it's been stopped since 2010. There's really nothing out there, and most of the Department of Energy's people who worked on the license application are gone. NRC people are either gone or working on something else. So it's going to take time and money just to recreate something that is capable of processing and, from DOE standpoint, defending a license application. So what they looked at the cost, the estimated cost of what if we try to plow ahead with Yucca Mountain with all of the problems that we know we're going to have. And they've looked at some generic work that the Department of Energy has done just on other repositories and other rock types and under different conditions. And they came to the conclusion that it would be cheaper to start again than to try to push Yucca Mountain through. I told you about some legal problems. This is just a list of the lawsuits that are out there now. And if the proceeding goes forward, the first 4 will be instantly put back into action. And they will be litigated, and the first 2 actually are the basis of the license application. We're going to be essentially in trial based on these 2 regulations. So we'll be in trial at the NRC, and we'll be in trial in court at the same time. And there's no certainty that the regulations that the hearing is based on will actually stand up. So it could be a waste of everybody's time and money. The 5th one, the Texas lawsuit, is sort of a joke. We can't figure out why they did it, but it's mainly just to try to force the Department of Energy to go forward with Yucca Mountain licensing, and it's not even really worth discussing much right now. Congressional appropriations, the House has always tried to sort of push the project ahead based on just a very few people in the House Energy and Commerce Committee. Most of the House members really don't care because they're just glad it's not them. So in the House, they put up $120 million for DOE, $30 million for NRC, and this is nothing. Remember, I told you it's in over 4 or 5 years. It's going to cost about $2 billion, with most of it from DOE, and 120 million doesn't really touch the 400 to 500 million that DOE is going to need. So this is just pretty much a placeholder. In the Senate, they passed a bill, the Senate Committee on Natural Resources, or the Senate Appropriations passed a bill that doesn't even fund Yucca Mountain. It funds just the beginning of looking at an interim storage program. The House bill I'll talk about in just a minute, but the House bill has been passed by Energy and Commerce, but it has not made it to the floor. The Senate bill hasn't made it to the floor, and we don't know what's going to happen. So for the remainder of the fiscal year, after the December 8th decision about the end of a continuing resolution, we have no idea what's going to happen with funding for the rest of fiscal 2008 that goes to October 1st in 2018. There's some legislation out there. One of them comes from Nevada members that just says that you need the consent of the people of the state through their very offices in a written agreement with the Secretary of Energy. And Nevada has assured the Secretary of Energy and anybody else who will listen that we are not consenting to anything. And so this bill is to try to just say that if you want to try to go forward with forcing us to take a site and every other state gets a pass because they have the consent ability. That isn't going to work. The one that is right now in sort of the biggest play is the House Nuclear Waste Amendments Policy Amendments Act of 2017. Its primary purpose is to expedite licensing of Yucca Mountain. Its secondary purpose is to make sure that Yucca Mountain is probably the only site by lifting the original cap on how much waste can go into Yucca Mountain, because the idea was that there should be a cap so that Yucca Mountain isn't, this was way back in 1983, so that Yucca Mountain isn't the only site in the country. It was to assure that there would be a second site, and because almost all of the waste in the country is east of the Mississippi. And we ended up sort of the default site because the west is where you dump stuff. It also directs DOE to start an interim storage program, but it has a minor little glitch in it that requires the capacity to be so small that nobody would ever build it. The author of this bill, John Shimkus, doesn't want interim storage. He threw it in because other people do, but then he sort of hid a poison pill that sits there. It also takes access to the waste fund, which is the way that this whole program is to be funded, which comes from a fee on everybody who uses nuclear power. A tenth of a cent per kilowatt that you use goes into that nuclear waste fund. And that nuclear waste fund right now has about $40 billion sitting in it. Most of the 15 that's already been spent came out of that. But the only way the Department of Energy and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission can get that money is through annual appropriations. So it becomes a political game every year to fund the project, and that's why the funding levels have gone up and down, and that's why Senator Reid was able to essentially kill the funding. So what this bill does is it makes portions of every year, significant portions of money out of the waste fund to the Department of Energy every year mandatory. Well, this is where things get really funny, because this is something that the Appropriations Committee doesn't like to do. It's a very unusual thing where you have mandatory expenditures for something. So just this week, it turns out that the House Appropriations Committee has objected to that feature of mandatory appropriation, meaning they have absolutely no say. That money just goes every year. And they don't like to give up that kind of jurisdiction, and they're, at this point, claiming that they won't. If they don't, the bill doesn't go to the floor. And if the bill does go to the floor and pass by some amazing chance, the Senate isn't going to hear it anyway, so it's pretty well dead. The Senate had a bill last session, but not this session, that pretty much implemented the recommendations of that Blue Ribbon Commission that I told you about. It's one option for how you implement it. There are other options. We expect this bill to come back, and there might be at least a debate on how to implement the report through various types of options. The main thing is the consent base. It's also a key factor of it is getting the program out of DOE and putting together some type of an independent agency, or maybe even a government and private corporation, some organization whose only responsibility is trying to figure out nuclear waste management policy for the country. And this, I think, will bring a lot of debate, but likely probably won't go anywhere either, because it has relatively few sponsors, and no matter what they do, it's going to be way more money than this Congress is ever going to be willing to spend on anything, as far as I can tell. And now, just because Yucca Mountain has been such an issue for so long, and all kinds of people are affected by it and think about it, and this is just a poster and a t-shirt design that showed up a few years ago in Las Vegas, and it's sort of making the rounds. So now Judy will, as I said, tell you everything that I didn't say.
So Steve covered the history and got down in the weeds with a lot of this stuff, and I'm the people person, and we'll carry on from there. In telling you, go ahead to the next one. One of the things that we hear a lot of times from people is that you've got Yucca Mountain, why are we even still talking about this? We need to take the waste there and just get this thing going. Let's fast track it and get things going. But as you can see there, all there is a hole in this hill where they did experiments. The hole goes in one side, it comes out the other. It's about 5 miles all the way along. But there's nothing in there that would take care of the waste. And now there's no facilities on the outside. All of the surface facilities that they had there have been dismantled, taken away. And I would guess that there's probably been some deterioration inside the tunnel that you see pictured there, because nature kind of tries to put itself back together again. So I would guess there's probably been some rock fall, and probably the tracks running through are doing this because you got a lot of earth movement out there. But there's really nothing there. Today we took a ride with Molly out to see how the waste would come out of Diablo Canyon, or how you would try to do that. And there's 2 options, I guess, which are either barge out into the bay or on trucks that would come over a very windy road. And the trucks that carry this kind of waste, if you're trying to put it on a truck, the length of those trucks are the equivalent to 17 cars. And if you look at 17 automobiles, if you've ever tried to pass while you're on a trip out on a highway, and you're trying to get around 17 cars at once, that's very difficult. It's a very, very long thing. And you've got a very windy road that comes out from the reactor to where it would have to get to go onto a railroad track. So if it made it to the railroad track and it came, this is what happens when the waste gets into Las Vegas. It would come in on the Union Pacific rail line, and railroads were built to join cities or to connect cities, and they come through the center of most cities. And that's what happens here. Coming from the south, going on up, it would go right through the Las Vegas Strip. I don't know if you can see any of the names of the hotels, but the red spots on each of those are one of the resorts. And the one that's sort of 2/3 up, there's a spot that's there, that's the closest one that there is to the railroad tracks. And the fun thing about that is that it's the Trump Hotel. If you step out the backside of that, if you're going to take the garbage out, you're pretty much on the track. And the reason that there's a shaded line there, that's called the region of influence. And that's a half a mile on each side of those tracks. And with a licensed cask, a licensed railroad cask, you would be able to detect radiation without any accident, incident, whatever. They give off radiation, and it's detectable out to a half a mile on either side of the track. If there's a train parked and you're 6 feet from it, you would get the equivalent of an X-ray every hour. So there's a lot of stuff. Next slide. After it goes through the strip, it comes through the center of downtown, and all those little red spots up there are things like City Hall, the Discovery Museum, all of the main features in downtown Las Vegas. Next slide. If it came by truck, it would take the beltway that goes around the city, and that right now is pretty much the prime territory that most of the businesses moving into Las Vegas try and get spots on that, because it's easier to get around town and to get land that's affordable and available, and so that would be a really bad deal, and that's why you've got the kind of opposition that you have just from people in Las Vegas that don't want to see this thing happening. Next slide. Ian showed you a transportation map, and this is the preferred route that DOE would like to take. And it would mean if the transport got all the way through town, Las Vegas is in the bottom there, got on up the railway, there's no tracks to Yucca Mountain. So you've got to come from east to west, up there to the north, then it comes all the way back and down around, because that land is mostly Air Force land, and they do a lot of testing with heat-seeking missiles, and these things are pretty hot, so they would wind up being excellent targets, and that's why the Air Force has got a lot of problems with this thing. But you've got to come 300 miles, and on that east to the west, you're coming across 9 north-south mountain ranges. So somehow or other, they've either got to go over the top, tunnel through them, around through passes, or something. But it's a very difficult construction site, and it's going to be really expensive. Next slide. One of the things that I keep asking, and I've been asking for years and years, is we're trying to solve the nuclear waste problem. And before you can solve anything, you've got to know what the problem is that you're dealing with. And we've been told a lot of things. We've been told, if you don't get a repository, if you don't get a way to get rid of this waste, we're going to have to shut these reactors down. That's good news for me, but it's not said in a way that's to make people like me happy. But is the real problem that they're unable to make waste, that the pool is full, the outside, the dry casks are full, and they don't have any more place to put waste, so we've got to come up with a repository? Is it the problem that they would like to build more reactors, and they're not allowed to do that, like in California, until you can prove that you've got a permanent disposal for waste? Or is the problem actually that there's a safety issue and you've got to somehow or other protect people from this nuclear waste? If we could actually define what the problem is and define how big it is, meaning you've got to know when they're going to stop making waste so you know how much you're going to have, then I think there could be a way to start looking at solving the problem. Next slide. So what is a real solution? As the Blue Ribbon Commission said, you've got to probably have consensual siting or find a volunteer spot, because forcing it just doesn't work. And Nevada's not going to give up its fight. Nevada's in it to the end, and they're not going to say okay, and I'm sure that the Shoshone aren't going to turn around and say, yeah, okay, go ahead. So there are now many countries who have already learned this lesson. They tried forcing sites, and they don't anymore. So in Sweden and Finland, they have found volunteer sites, and other countries are looking for them. Next slide. But before you're ever going to find a site that's consensual or anybody willing to volunteer, there has to be some sort of trust. The community, the place where you're going, anybody who's going to say, yes, we'll work with you on this, has got to trust the other party. And there really just is no trust in Nevada. Nevada already did trust. They already tried this out with the Department of Energy or the Atomic Energy Commission, which it used to be when there was atmospheric testing. And as Ian pointed out, there was real damage that happened because of that testing. And people, it was very bizarre at the time that atmospheric and other testing was going on, because people were told that there was no danger to anybody, but at the same time, school kids were doing duck and cover at schools in case the Russians ever dropped a bomb, because that would be terribly dangerous and it would be catastrophic for us. Our own bombs there was nothing to worry about. So we were told the same thing this time, that there was absolutely no problem as far as dangers to people, animals, property, and that a waste repository would be perfectly safe. But we aren't inclined to believe that. Next slide. And one of the reasons we don't is because it wasn't just atmospheric testing, but when the Department of Energy showed up in Nevada, in southern Nevada, to start looking at Yucca Mountain, we were promised, we were told time after time, they were just here to do some testing. They wanted to see if Yucca Mountain would work. They had rules, they had guidelines, they had regulations, and they wanted to go out there and test that mountain and see if it met those things. And as Steve told you, time after time, as time went on, the site did not meet the standards. And when the site failed, they didn't walk away. They changed the rules and tried to make them fit the site. And that's what has been going on. And at some point, it sort of turned from a scientific endeavor to study the site into an engineering project to try and just make it work. Next slide. So the reality is that Nevada is not going to consent. The battle will go on. It's going to get costlier. It's going to take more time. And it's not just our politicians. We always hear that Nevada politicians are playing politics with this whole thing. We're turning the people, that they're turning us against this site. That's not true. Anybody running for office, statewide or a federal office in Nevada, is asked what their opinion is when it comes to Yucca Mountain, and if they're not opposed, I don't know that they could run and expect to win. Yeah. So that's kind of where we are right now, and we would love to take your questions and help you determine. I always feel really bad. I hear people all the time in Nevada saying, well, you know, they wanted those nuclear power plants. They wanted the jobs, they wanted the power, they wanted these things. And I remember 50 years ago, living in Minneapolis, rather young, and hearing that there was a proposed plant here at Diablo Canyon. And I remember a very prominent woman in Minneapolis at that time who was very much opposed to it, and we heard there was a lot of conflict. And she came out here and was part of a huge flotilla. I don't know if people in the audience were here when Diablo was proposed and when it was built, but there were a huge number of arrests, and she was one of those. And we all thought that she was rather strange for having done that. But at any rate, I know that people here didn't ask to be left with this problem, and I hate the fact that we're sort of pitted against each other, and I don't want that to ever happen. I know a lot of people here in the audience that have worked with us, so I don't want that to be the case. But we've got a little time for some questions if people would like to do that.
Thank you very much, Judy, Steve, and Ian, for coming here tonight. You did a terrific job. Thank you.